Welcome back. Continuing our discussion in the Psalms. Today we're not going very far from where we were last week. Last week we were in Psalm 14. This week, Psalm 15. And here's what it says. Very popular psalm. It says, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right, he who speaks truth in his heart, does not slander with his tongue, does no evil to his neighbor, takes up no reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but those who honor and fear the Lord, those who swear to their own hurt, and he does not put out his money at interest. Now, there's all these rules. Who can ascend the hill of the Lord? Who can come into his presence? You got to do all these things. You got to tick all these boxes. Listen to a parallel text that we'll also look at again next week. But Psalm 24, it says this, Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? The one with clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not act deceitfully. And so again, here are all these conditions to come into the presence of God. You'll find in Isaiah 33 a similar text. I know, not the Psalms, but you'll find in Isaiah 33 a similar text where the wicked are going, who can come into the presence of God? Who can dwell with the consuming fire of God? And then Isaiah offers a long list of things that enable you to come into the presence of God. Now, this is a little bit overwhelming, right? Because if you take all these places and you put them together, this idea of who can come into the presence of the Lord, who can stand in his holy place, who can stand before him, it might conjure up ideas like in Numbers 10, where Nadab and Abihu, like literally a day after being consecrated as priests with their father and their brothers, offer unholy or unauthorized fire before the Lord, and God strikes them dead, right? Just kills them. You get another place in Numbers 16 where some people come to Moses and to Aaron and they say, you've gone too far, Moses. You shouldn't be the leader of these people anymore. It's the rebellion of Korah. And Moses goes, okay, let's see who God decides should come and minister into his presence. We'll have Aaron bring a table of incense or a bowl of incense tomorrow, and you 250 rebels, you bring bowls of incense tomorrow, and we'll stand before the Lord and we'll offer him incense and we'll see who he picks. So the 250 rebels against Moses and Aaron come with their incense the next day, and Aaron comes with his bowl of incense the next day, and fire falls from heaven and burns up the 250. Only Aaron remains. And they take the bowls, these golden bowls of the 250 other men, and hammer them to the altar. So it'll be a symbol for everybody else in the future that, like, if you're not invited here, don't come here. Like, this is what happens to the people who weren't invited into the presence of God. And so there's all this idea of, like, who can come into the presence of God? Man, you got to do all these things. You got to make sure you've ticked every box. You've got to make sure that you've crossed every T and dotted every I. Even in Ezekiel 18, it says, the soul who sins will die, but the soul who does, and then it gives a long list of things, a long list of rules. These people will be called righteous. These people will live. Every place in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, under the covenant of the law, when the question of how can I come into the presence of the Lord is asked, there are so many hoops to jump through. There are so many things that we have to make sure that we're getting right. What does it mean for us to have clean hands and pure heart? What does it mean for us not to lift up our soul to what is false? What does it mean for us to not speak anything false, or not to chase after things that are false, or not to be unethical or dishonest in the work of our hands? I mean, if you boil it down, we talked about this a little bit last week, no one is good enough. There isn't any human being good enough to just be able to come into the presence of God. Even the high priest were only allowed into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies once a year, and that after first offering sacrifices for themselves so that they could come into the presence of God. And if something happened there that deemed them unholy before the Lord, he'd strike them dead. So we look at these texts, and I loved these texts, man. I used to preach Psalm 15 and Psalm 24 all the time. I loved this idea, and I would talk to people about, hey, you need to have clean hands, pure hearts. I wish I could go back and kick my own butt. Like, I really do, because the thing that I was missing before, I would talk about coming into the presence of God, and the thing that I was missing before was that I was putting on people a yoke, a weight, a system of righteousness that no one would be able to endure. I believe it's Luke 11. It's either Luke 11 or Matthew 23, but I think it's Luke 11 where Christ is rebuking the Pharisees. He does it in both texts, but they're a little bit different. The recordings of them are a little bit different. And in Luke 11, one of the things that he says to the Pharisees is, he says, "What are you scribes and you Pharisees who weigh down men with burdens too heavy to bear, and you don't even lift them. You don't even try to do it." And so, like, the problem of teaching Psalm 15 and Psalm 24 as a standard for the believer is that we've misunderstood the text. And we tell these believers, you got to have clean hands, you got to have pure hearts, you got to do all these things. The point of Psalm 24 and the point of Psalm 15 is the impossibility of it. Like it's not possible on our own to have clean hands and pure heart. It's not possible on our own to come into the presence of God. We can't work hard enough to be righteous or to be holy. We can't work hard enough to have clean hands. Even in Matthew, the Beatitudes, and we've talked about the Beatitudes before. If we haven't, we should have. But Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It's a reference back to Psalm 24 about those who will come into the presence of the Lord. And the point that he's making in Matthew is he's setting up this impossible standard even in Matthew. You have to be a peacemaker. You have to be pure in heart. You have to have all these things right in your life in order to see God. And what Jesus is about to do in chapter 7 is put himself forward as the means by which we come into the presence of God. See, there's a beautiful story. I was listening this morning on my way to record this video, in fact, to the book of Esther. And Esther is asked by her cousin Mordecai to go into the king and to appeal on behalf of the Israelite people, the Jewish people, to appeal for their lives. And she says, the king hasn't called me into his presence in months. And if I go in, if anyone goes into the king's presence and he hasn't beckoned you into his presence, he can put you to death. In fact, the only way that you'd be spared is if you come into his presence and he sees you and he has favor on you and he extends his staff to you. And that's the symbol that, like, no, it's okay to come into my presence. And you might not know this, but the book of Esther almost didn't make it into the Christian Bible because there's no direct mention of God. And so in the Council of Jamnia, 90 AD, details that aren't pertinent to this, so I'll shut up. Anyway, Esther is, I think that story of Esther is the picture of God, is the picture of Christ, because Esther comes before the king and the king extends his scepter and she is welcomed into his presence. And so I think it's really important for us to note that, like, you and I can't ascend the hill of the Lord. You and I can't stand in the presence of God on our own volition, on our own ability, on our own merit, on our own accolades. You don't have a wall of trophies big enough to earn you the favor of God, but God has extended to us Jesus Christ. And because of Jesus Christ now, we are welcomed into the presence of God. And so I love these texts in chapter 15 of Psalm and chapter 24 of Psalm, but don't misread them. Don't make them the standard for you as a Christian to uphold. See in them the impossibility of it and take hope and take joy and take delight in the fact that the way into the presence of God, the way to ascend the hill of the Lord has been opened to us through Jesus Christ. And we see that in Hebrews, that the way into the presence of God has been opened through the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. And so take that encouragement today, and next time you read those Psalms, hold that in your head. See you guys next week.